Choosing the right PC parts is always a challenge. It's always a battle between, compromise, because most of us at least, have limited budgets, limited amounts of money to spend. It's all about scarcity and stuff. So not all of us have unlimited money to build a PC. And the thing is, when you spend $100 extra on one part, you're losing out $100 of your budget that you could spend on other parts. So how exactly do you balance the budget, balance the books, get everything just right so you get the most out of your rig, get the most out of your money, and get the best possible PC? Well, this is my methodology for deciding what exactly are the parts to get, what exactly are the choices to make. And I think there's some things you can learn from it, and there are some things that you can take from it. You don't have to follow my methodology exactly, but I think what I say here makes a lot of sense. So if there are things that you think make sense for you, go ahead and do it. So let's start off with the basics of the PC parts you need so we can get the things going. You're gonna need a CPU, GPU, motherboard, case, power supply, storage, and RAM. The speed of your PC is mainly determined by your CPU and GPU's level of performance, although this is also slightly affected by your RAM. Now, this is very dependent on the apps that you're running, the software that you're running, especially in terms of order of importance, because games generally need more GPU power, while things like video editing and things like 3D rendering, CPU power is very important as well, if not even more important. Now, the snappiness of your computer is not only determined by the speed of the parts you have in here, because you can have a really fast CPU and GPU, but if you have slow storage and slow RAM, you're not going to have a great experience. So the snappiness is determined also greatly by the speed of your storage and the amount of RAM you have. Now, this amount of RAM, you don't really need that much to just have a decent experience. What you really need is just enough RAM to have all your apps running and not have to constantly, your apps don't have to constantly fight for RAM. You just need enough. Having excess RAM is not going to give you extra performance. Just having enough RAM is going to give you snappiness. That's all you want. And so for the rest of the parts, this determines compatibility, reliability, and cooling. So you got your CPU cooler, your case fans, the size of your case, your power supply. Your motherboard determines kind of the features that you're going to get, and if you get a good motherboard, it's going to be more reliable at the very least. And you definitely don't want to be cheaping out on your power supply. I want to say this from the get-go. Power supply is essential. It's the thing that's providing power to all your parts. So if it's crappy and it short circuits, or just like there's power surge and it just blows up all the capacitors on your CPU and GPU, then you're screwed. So you want to get a decent, if not a good power supply. So just as insurance against your whole computer dying from maybe some power surge or a brownout or blackout. So in terms of choosing the parts, if you're worried about compatibility, my biggest advice is to just use PC Part Picker. It's an absolutely great website. It's a spine of the community in terms of the PC building world. It's very useful, it's very convenient, and it's a great place to see all the parts that are available. Now, the first thing I would do is to definitely do research and get all the parts that can fit into your budget. Like, create a rough list of parts that might fit into your budget for kind of a rough start before we start tweaking from there, just to get a rough idea of what you would be spending on power supply, your motherboard, or your case. Get an idea, you want an ATX, MATX, ITX build, and then get a rough idea of how much your case, your power supply is going to cost you. Get a rough idea of the amount of storage that you want. Just get a rough idea all around of that. And then after that, I would go and focus in on performance first. So I'll go look at a bunch of CPUs and GPUs that might be able to fit into my budget. Roughly, I would spend about 50% of my budget, 50 to 60% of my budget on my CPUs and GPUs, because they are the most expensive parts of the rigs and they determine the performance the most. Obviously, you need to leave some room in your budget for other parts like your RAM and your stuff, but I would say only leave like 30 to 40% of your budget for those other parts, and you can always tweak the CPUs and GPUs you get. Look for some discounts, and you can always squeeze some budget here and there. So just leave 30 to 40%, you should be fine for your other parts first. Now you have your list of CPUs and GPUs that might be able to fit in your budget and create a good build. Have some expensive GPUs, some expensive CPUs, have a range of different prices in there. Use your list and obtain benchmark scores for these parts. Use reliable sources, not Julian Tate Tech, because his benchmarks are atrocious. Use some reputable tech review sources. I don't do benchmarks because I know I cannot compete with these big platforms. They have experience doing benchmarks, so I'm not going to try to challenge them. My favorite are Anantech, Gamers Nexus, and Puget Systems. Puget Systems especially is great for building a system for pro work, such as video editing and stuff, because they have a lot of professional software benchmarks. Now, just obtain the benchmarks for the games that you are playing and the software that you are planning to use. I don't like synthetic benchmarks because they don't really tell the story, tell most of the story, because each software interacts with your hardware differently and actually cares about different kind of performance metrics differently. For example, like Premiere Pro might care about single core performance, while DaVinci Resolve might care about GPU performance. Just to give an example, different software cares about different levels of hardware performance and different aspects of your hardware. So you want to get benchmarks from that specific software to get the most accurate reflection of what you're going to be getting when you build your PC. Next up, take a step back and think exactly like how will you use your rig? Will it be a lot of this? Will it be a lot of that? Like, will it be a lot of video editing or a lot of gaming? For example, if your software is that you're trying to do maybe 3D rendering, it benefits from a lot more from a fast CPU than a fast GPU. You need to add that and weigh that in your decision. Or if you're trying to game really hard in graphically intensive AAA titles at 4K, then you need to spend a lot more on your GPU and weigh that into your decision making and adjust the budget accordingly in your CPU GPU budget, move more to the GPU side of things. And then once you've got that kind of into the mix, into the recipe, then decide which benchmarks are the most important to you based on this kind of use case that you've decided. So if you're gonna be using a computer 80% of the time, you're gonna be doing video editing on Premiere Pro like I am, then I would base a lot of my decision making and a lot of my value calculations on the performance that I potentially will get from different parts in Premiere Pro, as opposed to basing it on the performance I'll get in a game. Because if the main purpose of my rig is editing, then it needs to work as well as possible in an editing setup. So once you've kind of decided which are the most important benchmark scores that are essential to your use case, use that to compare it with the price and decide kind of a rough price to performance, kind of a rough value. Don't forget that bundle deals are also a big part of the equation, because bundle deals often give you crazy cheap prices, so you need to factor that in your decision making as well, because sometimes a lot of discounts, they help you out a lot. Also, you need to factor in the price of other parts, because sometimes you can save on certain parts that are elsewhere in your rig because you went with a certain brand or certain model of chips. So for example, AMD with AMD CPUs, the motherboards tend to be cheaper for the same features as Intel, especially since many of the older motherboards on AMD's side are still supported with the newer CPUs. But on Intel, you can often save on getting slower RAM, because unlike AMD Ryzen CPUs, having fast RAM isn't super important to the performance of Intel chips. So this is why it's complicated to newcomers, which makes sense. There's a lot of variables, you plus one, then you have the minus one elsewhere. But relax, just keep rewatching this video, or you can message my Discord. There are a lot of people there happy to help you. It's linked in the description as well. Now you've kind of decided the right CPU GPU combination, which you factored in your other aspects of the rig that might change because of certain CPU and GPU choices. Like you need to pay extra for your power supply, you need to pay less for your motherboard because you went with AMD, you need to pay more for your RAM, things like that. Make sure you factor those things as well. Now you've got that going, use the remainder of your budget to kind of decide the side parts. So you want to choose a case, you want to choose the power supply. You need a power supply that is good, alright? Wattage isn't everything, it's about the quality of the capacitors and the circuitry inside. And there are power supply tier lists that you can look up on Linus Tech Tips forums. That's pretty good. Just Google power supply reviews from a website like johnnyguru.com. That one's really good. There are good power supply reviewers, and then there's crappy power supply reviewers that have no idea what they're doing. And I definitely recommend that you ask on the forums or in my Discord if there are any things that you're confused about. You just need to make sure that you spend on a decently good power supply, that's for sure. Choose a case that fits your motherboard, or the other way around, choose a motherboard that fits your case well. Choose a motherboard that's compatible with everything, obviously. And you need to factor in the fact that maybe you want some upgrade path down the line. So if you're on AMD's kind of CPU platform, you want to get a B450 or a B550, just so that there's a bit of upgrade path down the road, just maybe. Or you want to spend a little bit more on a slightly bigger power supply because you think in the future you're going to get some money and you're going to be able to upgrade your GPU. If those are things that are in the roadmap and you really want to do in the future, make sure you factor that in your pricing and part decision as well. And then when choosing storage, you need to not just decide on size, but also decide on speed. If you're someone who doesn't need a lot of storage, then you might just want to go full SSDs. As for SSD types, you've got NVMe M.2 and you've got SATA. These are the two main ones that you can find nowadays. I recommend if you are a first-time builder, go NVMe. It costs a little bit more, but it's a lot easier to deal with without having to route 2 cables and screw things in. It's just one screw, you slide it into a slot on the motherboard and it gets the job done. The speed advantages of M.2 SSD really isn't noticeable for pretty much everybody, unless you are someone who is running a server or really hitting your SSDs crazy hard. You are very unlikely to actually max out or tax the SSD enough to justify going to M.2 or even PCIe Gen 4. You definitely will not notice the advantage in games. So if you save money with SATA and you're willing to deal with the hassle of routing cables and dealing with SATA drives, then go with SATA, but I would say go with M.2 if you're not experienced with cable management. Now, as for the size of your storage, HDD is great for long-term storage and kind of medium-term storage. Like for files that are really big, if you're gonna have a lot of big files, hard drives are fine. But if you can afford it or you really need it, SSD is fast, speedy, and superior in almost every way except price. One's for keeping your family photos and the others for the games and apps that you're always playing or using, the apps that you always run, and for the files that you're always accessing, you want to put that on an SSD if you're using it all the time. I recommend you at least get a 250 gig to 500 gig SSD in your rig. That's really important for a good experience. Okay, now once we've done with choosing all of that, total it all up. Are you over budget? Okay, bummer. Most likely you will be. Can you afford this slight exceeding of your budget? Yes, then I guess it's fine. If it's not, then you want to cut down your prices. And my biggest suggestion is start by looking at cheaper alternatives in terms of branding. So instead of a high-end ADATA gaming SSD, I might go for a normal ADATA XPG SSD. Or instead of a very high-end GPU cooler, I might go for a cheaper GPU cooler. If my CPU cooler is a bit overkill for a CPU that I've got, then I just use the stock cooler. Maybe I get a cheaper case. You usually can get your stuff under budget if you've been reasonable from the get-go, just by changing around the brands and looking for a couple of discounts here and there. Cheaper motherboard, cheaper storage, cheaper RAM. But don't cheap out on the power supply. Now, this is very essential. I need to repeat this again. It has the potential to blow everything in your computer up. So spend a little bit and get a decent one from a reputable brand with reputable internals, so that in the long term you have a bit of insurance against a blackout or brownout. You can be less scared that something wrong will happen and kill everything in your computer. And once you've done all that, that's all really. Time to order your parts, and after you check for compatibility once more and for more discounts on something like PC Part Picker, and it's time to build your rig. Have fun. I would love to do an actual in-depth assembly build guide one day, but I don't have money right now, so support this channel if you want to help me out, and then I can actually do a build guide. I'm gonna end this video off here though. Thank you guys so much for watching. Goodbye.